Hey guys, Gregan here. Today I wanted to explain how stats affect PvP in Vindictus, and also I'm planning to share with you a build for PvP gear which is very cheap and effective. Honestly, it would be much better if there would be no equipment depending at all in PvP, because it just doesn't work with PvP systems. You know, in PvE, it's not that bad because you start with, low stats, but the bosses you play against are also, weak, right? So as they get stronger, you get more stats. As you progress, you basically all the time adjusted to the content which you play, right? So the only things that stats make unfair in PvE is basically just the fact that you will do, for example, less damage than another person, even though, let's say, you can't actually, decide whether someone is better or not. It's quite subjective, but generally, this is the only difference. Yeah, you would deal more damage than the other person, but nevertheless, both of you can actually finish the battle, which is the main point, right? Now in PvP you can't do it because when you play against another player, the difference of your stats decides about whether you actually win or lose. It's not anymore about who deals more damage, sort of, I don't know, side achievement. It's about literally winning or losing. And so if you have quite a lot lower stats than another person, you practically have no chances to win, even if you would be much better than that person. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this PvP is only about your stats, because that would be a lie. In fact, this PvP is probably the most skill-based from all of the PvP, any 1 versus 1 I've seen in any other games. It has a lot of personal design that basically makes huge difference whether you win or not, but nevertheless it leaves the problem with stats, which give you simply advantage or disadvantage, depending on which side you are. So yeah, if you're good enough, you could defeat someone with much better equipment as well, but that's not the point, right? I mean, we can't say something like this as justification for the fact that you can win with lower stats, so the stats are okay in PvP. No, that's not how it is. Stats make difference and they are unfair advantage, and they shouldn't exist at all. The person who wins should be the person who played better, and I just don't want a system, and I doubt any real PvP player would want a system where you have those stats as sort of a boost for disabled people who just can't deal with failure, yeah? So yeah, what I would like to have is a PvP system which actually gives a win to a person who played better, which is about skills, not about boosting ego, because some guy, can, I don't know, spend tons of money on Nexon, and, they just give him this win, so he can, feel happy or whatever. So this is my purpose for this video, where I'll share with you the build for PvP gear, which is very cheap actually, comparatively to, the usual paths which people choose when they play PvE, and it's more effective in PvP. Yeah, it's not, of course, the best gear you can have, but it's just something that will let you enjoy this PvP and just not lose all the time. And of course, you can upgrade it later on to have better stats if, what you have is not enough for you. But anyway, let's cut to the chase. So at the beginning, I would like to explain the difference between the way you should look at stats in PvP versus PvE. So one thing which you may know is sometimes people call another player as death stacker, and what it simply means is that person is simply stacking a lot of defense, right? PvE is based on learning patterns of movements of bosses, where you can see the pre-attack animation and then you simply react to it, right? You practice the timing and you use your dodge abilities properly to not get hit, right? So what it simply means is that the moves of bosses in PvE are basically 100% predictable, and you can actually practice and simply improve yourself to the point where you can do a battle without receiving any hits. So because of that, if you're actually good player who practice some battle a lot, you don't need actually defense or much of it to finish the battle. So this is sort of an indicator which people often use, that if they see someone with a lot of defense, it means, well, they think it means that he get it because he's getting hit a lot, which means he's bad, right? And yeah, it makes some sense in PvE, however it's not the same in PvP, and here's why. The first thing is that in PvP you don't have 100% predictable attacks. In fact, they are not predictable at all. What you have is a probability of things that may happen, yeah? You have the possibilities, what someone may do, but you can't actually know what will happen before it happens. So yeah, it's generally based on predicting those moves, trying to understand how someone may play. This is why you can't actually perfect your performance to the point where you wouldn't receive any hits. You just can't, you know, get that good, so you would literally win every fight without any hits in the way you can do it in PvE. Another thing is that it's about exchange of moves between you and the opponents. In PvE, when you fight boss, he has specified stats, right? As I was mentioning before, your stats generally are adjusted, you know, according to your progress. The bosses which you play against aren't simply, you know, like overpowered for your level or something, because the content progresses along with your stats, right? So in PvP that's not the case. In PvP it's about exchange between you and another player. And so if another player has, for example, lots of attack but less defense, and on the opposite you have a lot of defense but less attack, well, you know, if the calculation is equal, then you basically have equal stats, right? You have both the same effective attack. As example, let's say that your opponent has 25,000 of attack, 10k defense, and for example you have like 20,000 attack and 15k defense. So the way you calculate it basically is like you take your attack minus opponent's defense, and this is your effective attack, which is in this case 10k, 10,000, and then you take his attack minus your defense, which is 25 minus 15, so this is 10k again. Other words, you both have basically the same effective attack. There's no difference between your damage and his damage. So this is like the reason why you can't actually consider people who have, you know, more defense as so-called death stackers, because death stacker is this insultive meaning sort of to people who can't play, and in PvP it simply doesn't apply, because it just doesn't apply, yeah, as I explained. Okay, so now I'll explain all the stats, how much they affect your gameplay or how they affect your gameplay. I'll start with critical chance and critical resist, because these two stats are probably like the most impactful from all of them. So as you've probably noticed if you played PvP, when you attack someone with whatever attack, it deals less damage than in PvE. The reason for that is because in PvP you have additional damage percent reduction, but I'll explain that when I'll talk about defense. So basically when you hit someone with critical attack, you have like double damage. I mean, it can be different. For example, one has a little boost for critical damage, but in general it's around like twice more. And now in here the important thing to notice is that where in PvE critical resistance is sort of like useless, people don't really care about it, and well, the reason is because bosses don't really have like much of critical chance, so you don't actually have to boost a lot of this statistic. But in PvP, because you play against another player, they often have like, you know, usually, you know, the maximum value around is like 130 critical. Some of them have a bit more, yeah, but it's like very rare. So the reason to get more critical resistance for PvP is simply because, you know, your opponent has a lot more critical, and if you're capable to block his critical hits, then you can resist more damage. So the rule is the same as I was explaining before with attack and defense. For example, your opponent has 130 critical chance, but I don't know, 80 critical resistance, and let's say you have 80 critical chance but 130 critical resistance, and what it simply means is that you both don't have any critical chance, right? Because you take 130 minus 130, yeah, and it's 0. You take 80 minus 80, it's 0. That simply means that critical chance and critical resistance has basically equal effects on PvP, on damage. It has equal value if we talk about gear for PvP. And this is actually a good news, because there are scrolls like Resistant, for example, which give you 5 critical resistance, you know, 360 defense, I think, you know, and they take some attack, and people don't really use them in PvE, and they are very useful for PvP. And what happens is simply that this scroll is very cheap, so now you can use it for your PvP build, and getting that 5 critical resistance would be basically same effective as you would get 5 critical chance. Next important stat, which is very impactful, is actually HP. And again, it's a stat which is kind of forgotten in PvE, because players, you know, they use potions, so they don't actually need like a lot of maximum HP. They rather prefer to focus on stats like speed attack, balance, you know, attack, critical, whatever. So the reason why HP makes huge difference in PvP is because the fights are limited with time. So if you don't kill someone within 90 seconds in arena, the person who wins is basically the one who has more percent of HP, and this is the important part, because what it simply means is that it doesn't matter how much damage you deal. What matters is how much percent of damage you take from another opponent. So comparatively, let's say that you have two players. They have all the stats exactly the same. They have the same characters, besides HP. So let's say one player has like 5,000 HP and the other has like 10,000 HP, and they use some attack and they both deal to each other 1,000 HP. So now the person who has 5,000 HP loses basically 20% of his HP, while the person who has 10,000 HP loses only 10% of HP. So after calculation, that difference between HP, between exactly those two players, is that the person who has those 10,000 HP has basically additional 50% damage reduction. Now of course in real fights the difference usually isn't that high. I mean, unless you actually join with some low level character and you play against like end game equipped player. But yeah, it makes huge difference. I mean, even if, you know, the difference isn't 5,000 HP, like 5 to 10, this is like huge difference, 50% reduction, right? But even if you have like, I don't know, 8,000 and 10,000 HP, it still is a lot of difference. Because for example, that 1,000 damage for a person with 8,000 HP is 12.5% of his HP, and for the person with 10,000 HP it is 10% of HP. So in this case, that difference of 2,000 HP points would give to that person with 10,000 HP additional 20% damage reduction. So as you can see, it's still quite a lot. I mean, even if you would have something that tells you, I don't know, that you get 5% damage reduction, it still is like, you know, seems a lot, right? Okay, so now let's talk about attack and defense. Now the difference isn't as huge as in PvE. As I explained before, there's additional damage reduction for PvP, which is why you deal less damage in PvP than in PvE with exact skill. But in general, the way it works is that it takes your attack, and it's simply, every skill has like its own multiplier, and depending on your attack, it just multiplies, you know, one value for another, and you get the damage, right? And now, depending what kind of character are you, it may be more valuable for you to get more attack or defense. Because, for example, if you're some character, I don't know, like Karok or Herc or whatever, that has a lot of, you know, like damage in single skill, like high multipliers, what it means simply is that you'll get a lot of benefit from attack because it will multiply a lot. However, if you're a character which has very small multipliers and the skills deal simply low values, then it would be more beneficial for you to actually get defense, because what happens in here is that instead of actually trying to increase your attack, you know, well, in matters of percentage calculation it would be equal, yeah, but in practice what happens is that if you have more defense and your attacks are simply, you know, much like have much lower multiplier than another character which you play against, is that instead of increasing your attack, you increase your defense, so it lowers the multiplier of another player, right, of this character which you play against. So this is very useful in exchange of attacks, yeah, because if you have an option, yeah, let's say, I don't know, that Karok deals 1000 damage with some attack to you, and let's say your attack deals 400 damage, right? And now if you take that, and I don't know, let's increase it by 10%, right? So if you increase your attack with 10%, then you will have like 440 damage, right? And if you increase your defense instead by 10%, yeah, then you will have like, you'll basically, you need to deduce that 10% from opponent, so he'll deal 900 damage, right? And now if you deduce, 1000 minus 440, what you have left is basically 560. And if you deduce the other option, which is if you boost your defense instead, you take 900 minus 400 and you're left with 500. So you basically receive 60 damage less. And this is why for characters who have lower multipliers on their attacks, like, I don't know, Chain Vela for example, or Kaibo, it is better to boost defense, because when it comes to exchange, you actually deal, the exchange is better for you if you boost that defense. So in the simplest calculation, if character has high multipliers on attacks, it is better to get 1000 attack rather than 1000 defense, and if character has lower multipliers on attacks, it is better to get 1000 defense rather than 1000 attack. Now one more thing which I was talking about before is the damage reduction in PvP. So they have added additional damage reduction, which is dependent on your defense. And what it is basically is that at 5000 of defense, you gain 56% of damage reduction. Yeah, you basically receive 56% less damage, and it can be increased up to 70% if you reach 15,000. This is the reason why attacks in PvP simply deal less damage than in PvE. And I don't really know if there's like sort of scaling in between that. If you have, I don't know, 10,000 defense, does it give you some value between 56 and 70% that you, I don't know, for example, have 60 something percent or whatever? Or is it like you have all the time 56% damage reduction until you reach 15 when you get that 70%? But either way, it is something important to consider, because if you reach that 15,000 of defense, you gain extra damage reduction, right? So it is actually very useful to get, that value, the 15,000 of defense, so you can receive less damage. Because for example, if you would boost your attack instead, there's no additional like percent damage increase from it, right? It only affects that effective attack, which is the deduction from your attack and opponent's defense. So this is the reason basically why attack and defense don't have so much impact on PvP. And this is why I said at the beginning that critical, chance and resistance has simply, affects more the damage you deal or receive in PvP rather than attack and defense. Because in here, you multiply first, the effective attack with some exact skill, and then it's reduced by that 56 or 70%. And so, the outcome of it is, just the difference isn't that big. And if you take critical chance, if the difference is like basically twofold, yeah, like whether you deal 1000 or 2000, it is much more, yeah. So this is why, it is just more effective to actually boost critical chance or resistance rather than attack and defense. Now, if it's about balance, generally, it's not as much impactful as in PvE. Like, you don't have to have 90 balance exactly, because in PvE it's about doing DPS, right? I mean, in the end you have, this damage, and it tells you how much you dealt, right? So that, having more balance gives you sort of like more percent of damage, but in PvP it doesn't make that huge difference, because it's more about exchange. So this, few percent, like, I mean, this few damage usually doesn't make much difference. So yeah, generally it's like, and also that is about random chance actually between the attacks. You may actually deal more or a bit less, so it's just not that important. So generally, from my experience, that value of 70 points of balance is enough to be effective, right? You don't need more. So if you prefer, for example, to use fast enchant scroll, as long as the value doesn't go lower than around, that 70 points, it's fine. Now, two next stats will be speed and stamina. Well, stamina obviously, allows you to use more attacks or skills in general if you have more stamina. So, depending whether you actually need more stamina or not, you use it or not. But there's no, like, nothing important about it for the build, since you don't really use any scrolls for stamina. I mean, there's Armadillo or something like this, but it's much better to use resistant enchant scroll instead of armadillo for the PvP build. And if it's about speed attack, this is actually also a very important statistic, but I left it in the end because it's sort of separate from the others. It doesn't affect like the damage exchange, but it's rather something separate. So what happens with speed attack is that if you have more of it, the animations get shorter, yeah, you become faster, yeah, you can perform actions at the same time, you can perform more actions than with lower speed attack. And this gives you like advantage in terms of interaction, because you can react to something faster, you know, at certain situation, while if you would have, you know, lower speed attack, you need to wait for animation to end before you can use something, yeah, so more speed attack means that this animation lasts shorter, it's shorter, and so you can actually respond with another thing faster than normally you could with lower speed attack. However, there's also downsides to this, because in PvP, invulnerability time is different than in PvE. In PvE, you have specified like 0.6 of second, for example, of invulnerability time, no matter of the animation length, right? And in PvP, that's not the same. In PvP, the invulnerability time is equal to animation time. I'll talk about it more in another video where I'll explain all the basics of mechanics in PvP, but for now that's all you need to know. And what it means basically is that with lower speed attack, if you have a longer animation, this also means that you will have longer time where you can withstand some damage on single skill, right? So if you have, you know, longer dodge animation, then, you know, you don't have to dodge right after as fast as normally you would, because the animation is longer, right? So you have more of this invulnerability. So depending, you know, if your speed attack is like enough for you to interact, like you can interact enough fast, respond with your attacks to certain situations, then I would rather keep it on that at that point, not try, you know, I wouldn't try to increase it more, because if it's not needed for you to simply respond to some action enough fast, then it's only giving you actually, you know, like this downside of having shorter invulnerability on your dodge, which could be actually useful in many situations. Okay, so that's all if it's about explanation of stats. Let's now get to the PvP build. Oh,
alright.
He noticed. Oh no, he's running! No!
If I roll a 6, I'll enhance my weapon. Oh, I got a 1. I guess the weapon stays alive for now.